Britain's forgotten killers. 6 days, a passionate love affair, and a trail of terror across Blackout London that left one man dead and another fighting for her life. This is the true story of Karl Hulten and Elizabeth Jones, the British Bonnie and Clyde. My name is James, and this is Midnight's Metro Mysteries, where we take a step into the unknown on the last train home. London, 1944. The city was still gripped by war. Londoners lived in constant dread of one of Hitler's most terrifying weapons, the silent and deadly V2 rockets. The streets remained locked in near total blackouts. Nerves were stretched to breaking points, crime was rampant, and bomb sites scarred almost every corner. Into this dark and exhausted city stepped two unlikely individuals, Karl Hulten and Elizabeth Jones. Karl was a 22-year-old American citizen. Before the war, he worked as a grocery store clerk and a mechanic, supporting his wife and young child. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Karl was drafted into the US military and in 1944 was stationed in England ahead of D-Day. He would, however, never see a single day of combat. One night, after deciding he wanted no part in the war, he stole a pistol, an officer's uniform, and a 10-wheeled military truck, then deserted from his base. He reinvented himself as Lieutenant Ricky Allen and claimed to be a hardened Chicago mobster, all in a bid to impress and seduce the women of wartime London. Elizabeth Jones, known as Betty, was an 18-year-old Welsh runaway from Heath. At 16, she married an older soldier, but the relationship became abusive, so she fled to London. There, she scraped a living as a waitress, a cinema usherette and a barmaid before eventually becoming a striptease dancer under the name of Georgina Grayson. Obsessed with Hollywood gangster films, she dreamed of becoming a real-life gangster's glamorous girlfriend, just like the one she had seen on the big screen. The stage for what was to come over the next 6 days was now set. All that remained was for their paths to cross. Tuesday, 3rd of October, 1944. In a humble tea shop in Hammersmith, Elizabeth sat talking to a friend. After a particularly disastrous performance, she had just been fired from her job as a stripper and was at a loss as to what to do next. Karl, still impersonating Lieutenant Ricky Allen, happened to enter the very same tea shop in his stolen military uniform. Elizabeth's friend recognised Karl and introduced the two. Elizabeth was immediately captivated by his affected gangster persona, and they arranged to meet later that evening outside a cinema in Hammersmith. Elizabeth waited outside the Broadway cinema in Hammersmith, but there was no sign of Karl. After what felt like an eternity to her, she decided to head home, convinced that she had been stood up. At that very moment, a 2-ton army truck pulled in front of her and Karl opened the passenger door. She climbed into the stolen military vehicle and the two drove off into the night. As they chatted, she told Karl she would like to do something exciting and also revealed her dream of wanting to be a gangster's glamorous girlfriend. With this revelation, Karl told Elizabeth the truth. Well, some of it at least. While still maintaining he was a Chicago gangster called Ricky Allen, he informed her that he was an AWOL soldier who had stolen the truck they were sitting in and even pulled out the pistol he had taken for her to hold. Far from being put off, Elizabeth was utterly hooked. The two continued driving out towards Reading, and with this new information, Karl began actively searching for crimes to commit. On a quiet road, he spotted a lone girl cycling home. Without hesitation, he accelerated the heavy truck and deliberately swerved to knock her from her bicycle. She tumbled into the road, and before she could cry out, Karl and Betty were on her. They snatched her purse, left her potentially injured in the road, climbed back into the truck, and blazed off into the night. Though relatively tame for what was to come, this first taste of crime had opened the door to far darker events. Thursday, 5th of October, 1944. Whilst Elizabeth was relaxing in her one-room flat, Hulten called for her at around 5:30 p.m. They arranged a second date for that evening. They went out for a meal, followed by a trip to the cinema. At this point, most couples would have said goodbye for the evening, gone to a bar, or maybe even gone home together. Elizabeth and Karl, however, decided to go and look for more trouble. They once again climbed into Karl's stolen truck with the intention of robbing a pub at gunpoint. Elizabeth wanted to live out her American gangster movie. Perhaps she imagined Karl holding up the owner while she walked around the bar, filling a sack with cash, stealing cigarettes, alcohol, and running off into the night. This, however, did not come to fruition. They got cold feet, turned around and decided to stay in London. She now suggested to Karl that they should hold up the driver of a taxi. They spotted a cab and followed it out towards Cricklewood, overtook it in the truck, sharply came to a stop in front of it, and the two ran out in front of the car, Karl brandishing the gun at the driver. Once again, however, they got spooked. Karl noticed that there was a passenger in the back of the taxi, and the two ran back into the truck and sped off into the night. Having had two failed plans for the evening, some might have said it was time to stop, but it did not deter them. Later that evening, whilst driving along Edgware Road, they spotted a young woman struggling along with two heavy suitcases. Her name was Violet May Hodge. Violet was an 18-year-old waitress from the West Country who had simply missed her train from Paddington Station. Karl pulled the truck over and they offered her a lift. Sadly, Violet accepted. Near Runnymede Park, close to what is now Heathrow Airport, Karl slowly pulled the truck over on a quiet stretch of road, complaining that the truck's handling didn't feel right. He got out and began meticulously inspecting the tyres, searching for a suspected puncher. Elizabeth and Violet also stepped out and joined him in the search. Whilst Violet was looking the other way, Karl grabbed a thick iron bar from the truck, slowly and silently approached her from behind, raised the crowbar high, and with tremendous force, smashed it down onto Violet's skull. Violet, however, fought back. She clawed at him, screaming at the top of her lungs, but there was no one around to hear her cries. Karl raised his fist and brutally punched her in the face, inflicting serious damage to her right eye. This sent her crashing to the ground, where Elizabeth, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, leapt on top of her and began strangling the life out of her. Only when Violet stopped struggling and appeared to have stopped breathing did Elizabeth finally stop. They then robbed Violet's motionless body, taking her money and even her coat, then dragged her lifeless form to the riverbank, pushed her into the freezing water, and set off in the truck back to London. There would be a twist in the tale that would come back to haunt them, however. Amazingly, Violet was not dead. It is alleged that the shock of the cold water was enough to bring her around from her state of deep unconsciousness. In her bloodied, battered and bruised state, Violet somehow managed to drag herself out of the flowing river and limped towards a nearby farmhouse. She shouted and screamed, and thankfully this time the residents could hear her. She was hospitalised with severe head injuries, damage to her left eye and bruising to her neck, but thankfully went on to make a full recovery and gave a detailed statement to the police. Having arrived back in London after their evening of shocking violence and believing they had just murdered an innocent woman in cold blood, Elizabeth invited Karl up to her flat and the two became lovers. Karl would now stay with Elizabeth in the one-room flat at 311 King Street in Hammersmith for the remainder of the spree. Saturday, 7th of October, 1944. After spending the last few days locked away in their newly christened love shack, Elizabeth and Karl emerged in the early hours with a new plan. At around 2:30 a.m, they flagged down a private hired driver in Hammersmith. His name was George Edward Heath. George was a 34-year-old Dunkirk veteran who had been medically discharged after surviving the fierce battle of 1940. He now scraped a living driving his Ford V8 for anyone that would pay him. George pulled over and the two lovers climbed into the back seat and instructed him to drive towards Chiswick. As the car moved along the blacked out streets of West London, Karl leaned forward and in a low, calm voice said, "Pull over." George followed the instruction and turned to open the passenger door. In that instant, Karl reached inside his jacket, pulled out the stolen pistol and fired a shot directly into George's back. George's injuries were hideous. The bullet entered his back, nicked the underside of his 6th rib, perforated both lobes of his right lung, and exited through another rib and out the front of his chest. The bullet had also severed his spinal cord, causing immediate paralysis from the chest down. George suffered massive internal hemorrhaging and, unable to move, lay slumped over the steering wheel of his Ford saloon, bleeding out. Whilst George was lying there, Elizabeth coolly and coldly leaned forward and emptied his pockets. She took £8 in notes, roughly around £400 in today's money, a cigarette case and a fountain pen. She also undid the watch from the dying man's wrist and slipped it into her handbag. Karl jumped into the front of the car, pushed the poor man out of the driving seat, leaving him slumped partially on the passenger seat and partially on the floor of the car, and continued to drive on. Any of George's possessions that Elizabeth did not want, including paperwork, were thrown out of the window as the car made its way through the night. For 15 long minutes, George lay in the front of the car, bleeding out, fighting for breath and paralysed, before he eventually died of blood loss. At Knoll Green, near Staines, Karl pulled the car over in a quiet spot. He opened the passenger door, pulled the lifeless and blood-covered body of George Edward Heath out of the car, dragged him along the ground, and with Elizabeth's help, pushed him face down into a water-filled ditch. What had begun as a simple meeting in a cafe on Tuesday had spiralled in the space of a week into a frenzy of crime and sex, and by Saturday, Karl and Elizabeth had crossed the ultimate line into cold-blooded murder. The next morning, George's body was found by a fireman who was returning home from the night shift. The items that had been thrown out of the car window the previous evening had also been found by an electrician's apprentice. It did not take the police long to identify George and to also realise that his car was missing. A description of his car and its registration number was circulated to all police stations in London. The net was beginning to close in on Elizabeth and Karl. Instead of running or hiding, however, they sold the dead man's watch, went to the pub, and ended up at a greyhound racing track at White City Stadium, frivolously throwing the dead man's money away, betting on the races, ordering lots of drinks, and generally having a carefree day. Karl couldn't bear to part with George's Ford V8, and so recklessly parked it on a high street in Fulham. That evening, PC William Waters was walking the beat in his local area and discovered the missing car from the George Heath murder case. He telephoned Hammersmith Police Station and was joined by detectives. They held a stakeout and secretly watched the car to see if anyone would return to claim it. At 9 PM on Sunday evening, Karl Hultén approached the car, took out the dead man's keys from his pocket, unlocked the door and got inside. Detectives pounced. They dragged Hultén from the car, threw him to the floor, and then searched him. In his pocket, they found a recently fired Remington pistol, later confirmed to be the one used in the murder of George Edward Heath. Under intense questioning, Karl tried to use Elizabeth as an alibi for his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Police officers would go and visit Elizabeth, as she would eventually confess to the 6-day crime spree and implicated Karl at the same time. On Tuesday the 16th of January 1945, Hultén and Jones stood before a judge at the Old Bailey. Their trial took 6 days before they were eventually found guilty, and both received the death penalty, with Elizabeth reportedly taking the sentence so badly she had to be dragged kicking and screaming from the court back to the cells. On the 8th of March 1945, Karl Hultén was hanged at Pentonville Prison just 5 days after his 23rd birthday. 2 days before Elizabeth was about to meet the same fate, she somehow received a reprieve. She had her death sentence downgraded to simple prison time, and this caused an incredible amount of controversy both in London and her hometown in Wales. Many people considered the horrendous crimes to be cowardly, at a time when the war-torn British population had all pulled together to face a common enemy. Jones's actions almost seemed treasonous. In several locations in her hometown, the words "she should hang" were graffitied, such was the public's displeasure. Jones was released after just 9 years in prison, which many felt was incredibly disrespectful to the victims. Prison psychologists made pessimistic predictions that she would never go on to lead a normal life, and could indeed be a danger to the public. However, if there is one crumb of redemption in this story, it seemed that Elizabeth was determined to find it. It is reported that she changed her name and indeed changed her life. She became a nurse at a caregiving facility in Cheshire. She remarried, had 2 children, and later emigrated with her family to the United States, where she lived until 2006, when she died at the age of 79. After finding out about this story, many questions came up for me. I wonder if Elizabeth ever told anyone her story. The story of 2 young lovers going on a wartime gangster fantasy that spiraled out of control and into cold-blooded murder. Or if as an older lady she sat in a rocking chair looking after her grandchildren, with everyone around her completely unaware of the week in 1944 when Grandma went on a crime spree. What do you think? Do you think Elizabeth would have told her family about that mad week in 1944? Do you think the victims received proper justice in terms of Elizabeth's lenient sentence? Let me know in the comments. So with that, we come to the end of our journey into another of Britain's forgotten killers. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. There is a link on screen now that dives into another forgotten British killer. My name is James, and this has been Midnight Metro Mysteries. Please stay safe.